I'd been working as a seasonal caretaker at a backcountry campsite along the Appalachian Trail for about 6 weeks when it happened. It was early October. The nights were getting longer and colder, and the last of the summer crowds had thinned to the hardy thru-hikers and a few stray weekend backpackers. I liked the quiet. I liked waking up to frost on my tent and the muted rustle of leaves ready to drop. I liked the feeling that I was the only person awake in hundreds of miles of dark woods. But on that night, or maybe I should say that morning, since it was a little after 2 a.m., the quiet turned on me. I remember exactly how I woke up. One sharp bang, then another. For a moment, I thought it was the wind slapping my rainfly, or maybe a branch falling from one of the oaks overhead. Then the banging came again, deliberate. Someone was pounding on my tent. I unzipped the inner door, just enough to peer out. My headlamp caught 2 shapes in the darkness. Men. They were leaning close, faces pale in the beam of my light, both breathing hard, his breath visible in the cold night air. I smelled whiskey before either of them spoke. "Mom," one of them slurred, knocking again on my tent pole so hard it shook. "You gotta help. There's a guy with a knife stabbing people up at the shelter. Blood everywhere, man." My mouth went dry. I looked past them into the trees, half expecting to see someone else lurking behind. But it was just the 2 of them, filthy backpacks slung haphazardly on the ground, cheap aluminum bottles sticking out of their side pockets. They reeked of sweat and booze. "Where?" I asked. "Up the ridge. Maybe a mile, maybe less. At the shelter he was." The second man tried to finish the thought, but just stared at the ground, blinking slowly. I took a breath and made a choice right then. I wasn't letting them inside my tent. I wasn't unzipping the door any farther. "Sit by the fire pit," I told them. "Don't go anywhere. I'm going to call for help." I heard one of them mumble something about a lighter. The other one laughed, but it came out like a choked sob. I zipped the door shut, hands trembling, and groped for my radio. It was 2:30 a.m. when I called the backcountry ranger. "Rick, you there?" "This is Anna," my voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Rick, come in,"
I pressed the talk button
and told him 2 drunk hikers just came banging on my tent. "They say someone's stabbing people at Ridgeback Shelter. They're acting weird. I don't know if it's true or if they're messing with me. I need you here." There was a pause. I imagined Rick sitting in his trailer a few miles down the service road, pulling on his boots. When he spoke again, he sounded calm, which helped a little. "Lock yourself in your tent. I'm on my way. Sit tight, Anna. Over." I wanted to say, "Please, hurry," but didn't bother. He knew. Outside, the men were arguing about the fire. One of them shouted, "I said use the dry stuff." Then something crashed. Maybe they'd knocked over my pile of split wood. I stayed inside my tent. 20 minutes passed, then 40. I checked my watch every few minutes, like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. I thought about unzipping the tent and trying to calm them down, but every time I heard their slurred voices spike into shouting, I froze. Around 3 a.m., I heard Rick's TV engine. A few seconds later, I heard Rick's boots crunching on frosty leaves. "Evening, gentlemen," Rick called out. They both started talking at once. A slurry mess of a came at us, and we tried to stop him, and he had a big knife, man. Big knife. Rick shushed them like a teacher quieting rowdy kids. I crawled out of my tent at last and saw him standing there, shotgun resting easy in his arms, but the barrel pointed low. We sat by the fire pit. Rick stayed standing, watching the drunk men like they were a pair of wild dogs. I kept waiting for Rick to tell them to shut up or sit down again, but he didn't raise his voice. He just watched. The drunks repeated themselves, looping the same broken story. A fight about missing gear, someone getting mad, someone pulling a knife. They argued over whose knife it was. They argued over whether the victims were dead or just bleeding. Every time they contradicted themselves, I felt a little colder inside. Around 6 a.m., just before dawn, the two of them slipped into the trees when Rick and I were distracted, trying to radio the sheriff's office again. I didn't see them leave. They just melted into the dark. Rick cursed under his breath and pumped the shotgun once for effect. By the time the deputies arrived, pale-faced and shivering from the rough ride up the service road, the sun was breaking through the trees. The deputies listened to what little sense I could give them, the drunk men's ramblings, the directions to Ridgeback Shelter. They left one deputy with me and Rick and set off up the ridge with the other. They found bloodstains at the shelter, a torn sleeping bag, signs of a scuffle, and tracks, faint but clear, leading toward the forest road. Hours later, word came in on the radio. 2 hikers had stumbled onto a ranger station up near the next highway. They were cut up badly, but alive. They'd been stabbed over an argument about stolen food and someone hogging space in the shelter. I don't know if they ever caught the 2 drunks. They never came back down my way. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. I stayed another month before the season ended. And I swear, after that night, the silence in the woods never felt the same. Not once. I was 13 that summer. My parents had finally saved enough vacation time for our first real backpacking trip on the Appalachian Trail. My dad called it his dream to hike a stretch of the trail with me before I got too old to want to hang out with him, as he put it with a laugh. I didn't tell him then that I secretly liked these trips more than anything else. It was the only time he wasn't buried in work calls or staring at bills spread across the kitchen table like a losing poker hand. We'd been out for 5 days by then, deep into the forest, places you couldn't reach by car, the places where you felt like the rest of the world had disappeared. It was Father's Day weekend. My mom had packed little cards and a couple of chocolate bars in her pack. She loved her little surprises. I wanted to do something too. So, while she boiled water for dinner and Dad sat on a fallen log scraping mud off his boots, I decided I'd sneak off and bring back a whole stack of good, dry firewood. Our campsite that night wasn't far from a small creek that fed into a wider stream. Other families were camped nearby, the kind of loose, temporary neighborhood you get on the trail when everyone stops at the same spot. Kids were chasing each other with marshmallow sticks, and somewhere, someone had a harmonica going. It felt safe, almost like home. I didn't tell Mom where I was going. If I had, she'd have fussed about me staying close. But I knew the woods well enough. I thought I did. I grabbed my flashlight, even though there was still some light left in the sky, and told myself I'd be back in 10 minutes, 20 at most. I crossed the flat area behind our tent and stepped into the trees. My boots crunched over last fall's leaves, twigs snapping under my weight. I liked that sound. I remember thinking how grown up I felt, out there on my own doing something for my dad. I found the creek after maybe 5 minutes of picking my way downhill through underbrush and birch saplings. The creek was shallow, with slippery stones worn round by years of mountain water. On the other side was a small rise covered in ferns and mossy logs, perfect deadwood for a decent fire. I stepped carefully to the edge, crouched down, and dipped my fingers in the water. It was icy cold, sending a quick shiver up my arm. That's when I saw him. He was just another hiker, maybe someone else gathering wood or filling a bottle. But he wasn't moving like that. He was just standing there, across the creek, half concealed by a cluster of skinny trees, maybe 20, 30 feet from me. He wore dark clothes, a jacket, even though it was too warm for one, and a cap pulled low. His hands were at his sides, and he was staring at me. I froze, crouched at the water's edge with my knees starting to soak through my pants. We stared at each other. I couldn't see his eyes clearly, not in the fading light, but I could feel them. He didn't nod or wave or say hi like everyone else on the trail always did. He just stood there. He'd wave and say something normal. So I shifted a step to my left, still on my side of the creek. The man moved too, matching me exactly, still half hidden by the thin trees. I stopped. He stopped. A cold twist worked its way down my spine. I tried to stand up straight, but my legs didn't feel steady. I looked down at the water, pretending I'd seen a fish or a rock worth picking up, hoping if I ignored him he'd just vanish. But when I glanced up again, he was closer to the bank. He'd stepped forward, 1 foot on a flat rock, angled like he might cross over if he wanted to. My mouth felt dry. I could hear my own heart, too loud in the quiet. I thought about calling out, "Hey, you okay?" But the words stuck in my throat. Something about him made it feel wrong to speak, so I did the only thing my brain could manage. I took a step back. He stepped forward. Another step back. He shifted with me, still staring. I realized with a jolt that the creek wasn't that wide. 10 feet, maybe 12 at most. And if he stepped into it, there was nothing to stop him from getting to my side in seconds. I told myself not to run. If I ran, maybe he'd run too. But standing there seemed worse. I thought of my dad back at camp, my mom humming while she stirred the pot on the little camp stove. I wondered if they'd even hear me scream if I needed them. I turned slowly, pretending to look at something behind me, a branch, a rustle, anything. Then I did the thing Mom always told me not to do. I bolted. I didn't look back at first. I just ran. I ran uphill. When I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, everything looked normal, except for how loud my own footsteps sounded. I don't know how long it took to reach the edge of our campsite, maybe 10 or 20 minutes. When I stumbled into the clearing, my dad looked up, surprised, my mom already half standing like she knew something was wrong before I said a word. "Hey, where'd you go?" Dad asked, frowning at the scratches on my arms. "You okay?" I wanted to tell him. I really did, but I didn't know how to explain it. What was there to say? That a stranger stared at me too long? That he mimicked me like some animal sizing up prey? So I shook my head, forced a small laugh. "Tripped on a log," I lied. "Didn't find any good wood anyway." Mom put her arm around my shoulder, fussing about the scratches, telling me to wash up before dinner. That night, I lay awake in the tent, listening to the wind in the leaves and the small pops of the campfire dying out. When morning came, and I pretended to forget, we packed up, we hiked on, we made jokes about blisters and dry trail food. But I didn't wander off alone again. Not that trip, not ever. I know I made the right choice, turning back when I did. Some moments in the wild don't give you second chances, and some strangers should never be given the chance to step across the creek. I remember my dad's voice, even now, telling me this story over cheap bourbon at the kitchen table. He'd lean back in his chair, the same grin every time, but the grin always faded when he hit this part. He and his buddy Roy had been working odd jobs all spring, changing oil, hauling cattle trailers for cash under the table when they decided they'd had enough of Texas for a while. They'd never seen the East Coast, never seen. So they scraped together just enough cash for a couple of Army surplus backpacks, a few cans of beans, and a lift as far as Knoxville. From there, they figured they'd thumb it. Camp where they could. Hike what they could. Just drift for a while. Nobody thought it was smart, but they were in 20s. When you're 20, you think your skin is made of armor and your lungs can run forever. They hit the Appalachian Trail somewhere north of Asheville, but the parts behind diners and church graveyards where the old trail crosses service roads and you feel like you're trespassing on the bones of something older than the country itself. They slept under cheap nylon tarps, strung between crooked trees, shivering on cold nights. After a few days, the food started to run low. The cheap boots started to leak. The blisters were worse than either of them wanted to admit. They kept telling each other it'd get better when they hit the next town, when they could hitch to a gas station, buy some jerky. They'd been hiking since dawn that day, damp and tired, packs cutting into their shoulders, when they reached a narrow state road. The sun was high and mean, bounced off the cracked blacktop and turned the inside of your skull into a frying pan. They stuck their thumbs out at every pickup. Most slowed down just enough for the driver to get a good look at two scruffy kids sweating through their shirts before they gunned it back up to speed. Nobody wants to pick up drifters. That's just the truth of it. Then they heard the rattle before they saw him, an old utility truck, paint faded to that off-white color that used to be the fleet standard for half the power companies in the South. Rust on the wheel wells, a dent in the back bumper, a cherry-picker arm rattling in the bed. The driver pulled over before they even stuck out their thumbs. He leaned over, cranked the window down, and stuck his elbow out. He wore a trucker cap with a frayed patch on the front that said Carolina Light and Power. "You boys headed up the trail?" he asked. "Friendly?" "Yeah," Roy said. "Anywhere up to the next town's good." The driver jerked a thumb at the empty bench seat beside him. "Hop in." "Name's Lowell." They climbed in. No seatbelts. Lowell asked them the usual questions: where you from, where you headed, what's the plan. My dad told him they were from Texas, just drifting. He said it like it was something to be proud of. Drifting. Two kings of the open road. Lowell laughed at everything they said. That easy. He asked if they liked a good beer after a long hike. Of course they did, who wouldn't? He said there was this bar just off the highway. Real old joint, locals only, cheap pitchers. Just one stop before he dropped them at a good campsite up the ridge. Roy looked at my dad, gave a little shrug. Why not? One beer, then back on the trail. One cold beer sounded better than another can of beans in the dirt. They pulled into a gravel lot behind a bar that... Inside, it was dark. Lowell ordered the first round. They laughed about Texas, about the road, about how the city boys don't know how to piss in the woods. They didn't even notice at first when Lowell kept ordering shots. He didn't drink. He'd slide them down to Roy or my dad instead. Time slipped. The bar clock didn't match the one over the door. Lowell was gone for a bit out back, talking to someone. When they stumbled outside, blinking in the late afternoon sun, the truck was gone. No Lowell. No cherry picker. No backpacks. No cash. No trail maps. Oh, God. They were left with nothing. They asked the bartender. He shrugged, said Lowell left half an hour ago. Said he didn't know the guy well, just that he came through sometimes, drinking just enough to seem friendly, but never staying long. They found a sheriff's office 3 miles down the highway. The deputy on duty was polite enough. Took their story. Lowell. He shook his head. Never heard of him. Carolina Light and Power? No such company. Nobody reported a stolen one, either. Could have been nothing. My dad asked if they were gonna go look for him. The deputy just looked at him, really looked at him. Best thing you boys can do is find your way back home, he said. Trail's not safe for folks who don't know how to mind it. When they finally limped back to Texas, they didn't tell their folks the whole story. Just said it had been rougher than they planned. 6 months later, a letter showed up. Sheriff's office in some nowhere Appalachian town. Inside was a note. Found these on the station porch. Belong to you. Their packs, everything still inside. Money, photos of Roy's girlfriend folded in half. Untouched. Nobody ever saw Lowell again. Nobody ever came forward. My dad leaned forward, looked me dead in the eye like he was daring me to argue with him. He didn't just want the packs, kid. He wanted us. But something made him change his mind. Some things out there you never figure out, he'd say. Then he'd grin again, but it wouldn't reach his eyes. I've always believed that the woods could heal me. That's why, After a year that tore pieces out of me bit by bit, a breakup, a death in the family, the relentless grind of my job, I packed my battered backpack, bought a bus ticket to Virginia, and stepped onto the Appalachian Trail alone. I was 23. I did my research, got my permits, and mapped out my route from Rockfish Gap to McAfee Knob, section hiking one of the more popular stretches. I figured that if anything went wrong, I'd never be too far from other hikers. I thought that would keep me safe. The trail was crowded that first weekend in late May, families with kids, couples with dogs, small clusters of college students celebrating graduation. At night, I pitched my tent near shelters or designated camping areas. It never felt truly alone, not really. I could hear the quiet murmur of other people's conversations drifting on the wind, or the hiss of someone's camp stove just beyond the trees. But after 3 days, the crowds thinned out. I got braver, or maybe just greedy for more solitude. I left the shelters behind and picked a permitted backcountry campsite a few miles off the main trail near Three Ridges Wilderness. I found a spot on slightly higher ground beneath a stand of tulip poplars that felt like ancient guardians. The first night was perfect. I lay on my back, in my sleeping bag, listening to the frogs calling to each other down by a hidden creek. I drifted off with the gentle confidence that I was safe, that the wild would hold me like it always did. It was the second night when I noticed the footprints. They were small, maybe a size 8 or 9 in men's hiking boots, pressed clearly into the soft mud near where I'd set up my cook stove. I tried to tell myself they'd been there the night before, or maybe I'd just missed them when I arrived. I hadn't seen anyone for miles, but it was still spring people passed through all the time. Maybe someone had stopped for water. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I pushed it out of my mind. After dinner, I read for a while by the dwindling light of my headlamp. I fell asleep listening to the wind again. But then I woke, not fully, not at first. There was a sound, faint but definite. A crunch, then a pause. Another crunch. Dry leaves, maybe a snapped twig. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, eyes wide in the darkness, holding my breath so I could hear better. This was slow, careful, human. I fumbled for my headlamp. After a while, the sound faded. I turned off the light and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found broken branches near my tent low, at about shoulder height. They weren't from wind. They'd been pushed aside by something or someone moving through the undergrowth. There were new footprints, too. Clearer this time, pressed deep into the mud behind my tent. My skin prickled. I thought about packing up and moving on. But stubbornness won out. That night, I forced myself to eat dinner as usual. I made extra noise, clanged my pot against a rock, sang quietly to myself while I boiled my ramen, anything to make my presence feel bigger, louder, unafraid. When darkness came, I zipped myself into my tent, locked my knife in my hand, and lay there in the dark. Hours passed. I must have drifted off, but then the sound came again, closer this time. I forced myself to breathe silently, moving as slowly as I could to unzip the side of my tent away from the door. My boots were right outside, but I didn't dare reach for them. Barefoot, I slipped out the side, crouching low in the dark. I crept behind the nearest tree and pressed myself against it. Then I peeked out. He was right there, maybe 15 feet from me. A boy, he couldn't have been older than 16 or 17, crouched low beside my tent, peering in with a flashlight.
His clothes were dirty. I couldn't see his face clearly.
Something primal in me snapped awake, flight or freeze. I stepped out from behind the tree, my knife clenched so tight my knuckles ached. "Hey!" I shouted. "What the hell are you doing?" He froze. The light from his flashlight swung wildly, blinding me for a second. Then he turned and bolted into the trees. I stood there, legs shaking, for a long time. My skin crawled with the realization of how easily he could have unzipped that tent. how close he'd been, how many nights he might have been there. I packed up everything, ran the few miles back to the nearest ranger station. I told the ranger everything. He radioed the other rangers, logged my report, and told me to wait. They found him that afternoon. He'd been shadowing me for days, he said. He admitted it easily when the rangers pressed him. He told them he'd seen me setting up camp the first night and thought I was pretty. He'd meant to talk to me, he claimed, but he couldn't find the right moment. So instead, he followed me, watched me. The rangers said he'd been on the trail for a while, mostly harmless, just a runaway from a rough home. He didn't have any weapons, just a cheap flashlight. They decided not to press charges. They gave him a warning, banned him from the park for the season, and called his parents. They told me they'd keep an eye out for him. That was it. I still thinks about the boy sometimes. The feeling of him there in the dark. The crunch of leaves just beyond the reach of my light. Sometimes you have to stand guard to protect yourself.